Well, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to all our viewers joining us online. My name is Russell Hsiao. I am the Executive Director at the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between Taiwan and the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a biweekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, regular seminars like the webinar that you are participating in today, as well as an annual symposium where we feature leading experts and practitioners of US policy towards Taiwan to discuss current and future trajectories in this important bilateral relationship. In addition to these regular programs, we also have scholarship opportunities for academics as well as non-academics who are interested to conduct field research in Taiwan, as well as vice versa, for Taiwanese researchers and academics and non-academics alike to conduct short-term field research here in the United States. We also have cultural programs like movie screenings and movie nights that we include in our lineup of programs as well. If you're not already subscribed to receive our updates, you may do so on our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. I would be remiss if I began today's program without thanking our co-founders, our board of directors, advisors, as well as our staff and interns who make all our programs possible. So let's begin today's program. We are absolutely thrilled to bring to our audience today's book talk. A book talk with Dr. Daffyd Fell and Dr. Hsin-Huang Michael Hsiao on their edited volume, Taiwan Studies Revisited, published by Routledge. This is, I believe, the first launch event in the United States hosted by a US-based organization. I'm especially delighted for this program because this is a topic genuinely related to the work that we do here at the Global Taiwan Institute, although we're sort of on different tracks. And I cannot think of two better scholars to have this discussion with than the two of you, since you are truly at the forefront of this field and are playing an instrumental role in developing this field of Taiwan studies. And more parochially, I can see that many of the parallel and the challenges that you have faced in academia in developing this field is also present in my world or our world of Taiwan policy. And I would argue that we are similarly experiencing a golden age, if you will, in Taiwan policy here in the United States. And that is really opening up a space for more discussions about Taiwan and Taiwan policy. This book, Taiwan Studies Revisited, really provides a comprehensive overview of this growing field of Taiwan studies. And the both of you have assembled some really keen and incisive insights from leading researchers and practitioners from a very interdisciplinary backgrounds, including sociologists, anthropologists, international relations scholars. And I think in doing so, it really helps to demonstrate this discipline's very remarkable diversity, as well as complexity. And so our book talk today, our discussion will delve deeper into the contents of the Taiwan Studies Revisited, featuring a discussion of the past, present, and future of Taiwan studies. Of course, I should begin our discussion also with an introduction for our two panelists, the co-editors of this volume. Dr. Daffyd Fell is the reader in comparative politics with special reference to Taiwan at the Department of Political and International Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He's also the director of SOAS Center of Taiwan Studies. In 2004, he helped establish the European Association of Taiwan Studies and subsequently served as the Secretary General for 8 years. Dr. Fell has numerous publications that you can find on our website at the event link on our website. Next, we have Dr. Hsin-Huang Michael Hsiao, who is the chairman of the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation and chairman of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at National Zhengzhou University. He's also an adjunct research fellow with the Institute of Sociology, Academia Sinica, and a professor of sociology at the National Taiwan University and National Sun Yat-sen University. He's served as national policy advisor to the president of Taiwan, and is currently a senior advisor to the president of Taiwan. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here today. As I mentioned at the outset, I really do want this to be more of a conversation, and so I prepared a number of questions for the two of you so that we can facilitate this discussion. For our audience members, just a reminder that we are planning to reserve around 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. So you may submit your questions by sending them to contact@globaltaiwan.org or using the chat function on our YouTube page, as well as tweet us on Twitter at Global Taiwan. And I will repeat these instructions again later on in the event. So let's start. As I often like to do with these book talks, I always really want to get behind what the motivation and the sort of inspiration, if you will, for authors to really to take on this endeavor of editing a book. And so let's kick off. Well, what motivated the two of you to co-edit this book on Taiwan Studies Revisited?
Well, let me start on that question, because we were kind of looking for a way to kind of plot evolution of the field of Taiwan studies. A number of previous attempts to do this have been quite statistical. In other words, they've been looking at the number of publications in the field, books, journal articles. But the way we tried to do this was to look at some of the human stories. In other words, to look at the way that the careers of a number of Taiwan studies scholars had developed, and to do this via their early and influential publications. So we got scholars to revisit their early work, and then to talk about how their careers in the field had developed. So that was the kind of the goal. Actually, getting to the goal was quite a tricky process. We started off the project back in 2015 when we held the second World Congress of Taiwan Studies in London that Michael and I co-organized. And we had a number of panels that looked at this topic of Taiwan Studies Revisited, where people revisited their early works. The problem we had there was that we only had I think we had 4 chapters that came out of that conference back in 2015. So 4 chapters is not enough for a book. So we had to find new chapters. So the way that we got around this was to run a Taiwan Studies Revisited lecture series over the next couple of years, where we invited a series of scholars to come to London to give a talk about their early work and how their careers in the field had developed, and then to turn their lectures into book chapters. So I think we had 4 chapters from the Congress in 2015. 6 or 7 lectures that became chapters. So it was quite a complex process, but I think a really enjoyable one. And I think partly because of the kind of autobiographical nature of many of the chapters. And I think that was one of the things that for me as an editor, I found most enjoyable, finding out how authors first kind of fell in love with Taiwan. Often it was quite accidental. So, for example, a number of us were influenced by the Tiananmen incident, for example. In other words, a number of us were going to study China, but then the Tiananmen incident shifted us over to Taiwan. So overall, I would say that the book kind of engages with this idea that you mentioned at the outset of a golden era of Taiwan study. That I think comes up with some quite positive conclusions. In other words, it gives a sense of the kind of vibrancy and diversity of the Taiwan studies field. So let me finish there with just a few kind of initial thoughts.
Yeah. That's great. That's wonderful, Daffyd. And I do want to. You mentioned the World Congress of Taiwan Studies, so I do want to revisit that also later on in our conversation. Now, my next question. I know this may sound like a simple question, but I'm hoping that you'll give me a complicated answer. So what is Taiwan Studies?
Let me answer that. Taiwan study is an evolutionary process, outgrows from first sinology, which is a study of the ancient Chinese history, philosophy, and languages, and then change into the Chinese study, which we're taking to the contemporary Chinese word studies. And then now, the end state of what we are now is the birth and the growth of Taiwan study, which focus on Taiwan for its own merit, to take its Taiwan study, to take Taiwan as a subject matter of its own right. So I think that is something that unique compared to other area studies. You know, in every country can have a one X studies, even have a Japan study, Korean study, Burmese study, Indonesian study, Vietnamese study, American study. But Taiwan study has a very unique position. That means Taiwan study is established so that it can be differentiated from the so-called general Chinese studies. So a Taiwan study, it won't wish to be a distinctive, independent field of study, of an intellectual pursuit of Taiwan study. So I think that is the something. And I think they started in 1990. So only 2 decades, 3 decades or so. So I hope they answer the question of a Taiwan study.
Thank you. And if I may pull the thread a little bit, and this may sound like a rhetorical question almost, but why distinguish it? I mean, why does Taiwan study need an independent and separate field of study from sinology? I know that both of you have, I'm sure, a very good answer for this one. But I think for those, sort of general audience members, they may just say, well, it's indistinguishable. So why distinguish it? And why did you feel that this field was necessary in the first place?
It's related to the political and reality of Taiwan vis-a-vis PRC in that sense. Yeah, we don't mind talk about the historical Taiwan study. But yet, when we come to the contemporary world, Taiwan should be taken as seriously as of its own right. For example, Taiwan history. It cannot be read only from the shadow of a Chinese history. And we look at the Taiwan social, economic, cultural reality. It cannot be interpreted only through, or merely through the Chinese eyes. So I think that is very important. And more on top of that, if you look at the contemporary world after World War II, you can see why it's important to separate Taiwan from China as two different, of course related, when you come to the cross-strait relations. You cannot ignore one from the other, but come to the essence of what is going on under these two different societies, then you had to take Taiwan study more seriously.
Yeah, could I kind of come in there? Because I guess the answer to that question about what is Taiwan studies is probably a little bit different in the US or in Europe to the way that question is viewed in Taiwan itself. And I think that's partly because many of us that do Taiwan really have to negotiate these kind of boundaries, because some of us are located in, let's say, China Studies or East Asia departments. And a lot of those kind of scholars, they may need to teach China, but a lot of their research is Taiwan focused. And then we have another group like myself who are based in disciplinary departments who try to locate Taiwan within academic disciplines, like in my case, political science, in Michael's case, anthropology. So we have to kind of look for different ways to actually make Taiwan understandable. And I think that if you look at the kind of papers that are presented at, let's say, the European Association of Taiwan Studies, you also get a sense of what are the kind of the key themes and where does China fit. And I think one of the things we find is that there's not a huge amount of China-Taiwan comparison. For example, in my field of kind of comparative politics, often it doesn't really make sense to do China-Taiwan comparison. Compared to, let's say, Japan or South Korea is often a lot more fruitful. But I think that also varies according to the kind of research area. So, for example, in political history, maybe there's much more scope for comparison, but less so in comparative politics, for example.
Yeah, that's great. Now, Dr. Hsiao, you mentioned earlier that, or you guys wrote in this book, that introduction, that the purpose of the book is to provide an alternative perspective to the development of Taiwan studies, and we kind of scratched the surface of this in our discussion about why distinguish it. But can you maybe sort of, really highlight what is this other view of the development of Taiwan studies that you are trying to provide an alternative for?
Yes. Well,
Daffyd,
did you want to go first there?
Daffyd already mentioned about we are taking the author-centered, the scholar-centered approach in this book. In I or look at my own research on social movement and civil society activism, and Daffyd will talk about China policy. Actually, there has been a custom tradition. Look at the field. Actually, in the launching issue of the International Journal of Taiwan Study, we already published. Daffyd and I co-edited another special issue, launching issue called the current state of Taiwan studies. There are 8 chapters to look at the different fields, ranging from social movement, gender study, cross-strait relations, politics, and so on and so forth. So this is a very, very unique, as Daffyd described very well, is a human faces in it. I think, Daffyd, you might want to add it too.
Yes, I think to a certain extent, I was trying to kind of contrast our approach, which looked at the kind of career trajectories, to that of, let's say, Shelley Rigger or John Sullivan, who tried to create a kind of statistical analysis of the way the field was developing. In other words, how many books were published per year, how many journal articles were published per year, what kind of journal articles were they, what kind of journals were people publishing in, which I think is a quite a valid method. And I think the overall trend when we use those kind of statistics is very, very positive. And you can do a similar thing if you look at things like associations, the World Congress, EATS, NATSA. Again, the trend is very, very positive. But we were kind of just trying to look at the human angle. And I think also we wanted to show through these kind of stories that it is actually possible to have a successful academic career in Taiwan studies. Because I know stories where young scholars are warned, don't do Taiwan. It could be bad for your career. You're better off doing China. But I think that what we show is that there are strategies to actually thrive and have very rewarding careers in Taiwan studies. I think we find from some of the stories in the book how people did occasionally move away from Taiwan studies, and then they got dragged back in. Partly, and that was partly the kind of thing that Michael and I do, because we're always trying to persuade people to publish and research on Taiwan. And that's one of the goals of organizations like the European Association or the World Congress, to give people a platform to present their new research on Taiwan as a first step towards publishing on Taiwan. So we wanted to try and bring in another kind of optimistic angle on the field.
That's excellent, and I do want to. There's so many interesting parallels there in terms of the challenges and difficulties that young academics face in the field of Taiwan studies that also translate to I think in the Taiwan policy space as well. And I'd like to return to those themes later on. Something that you had mentioned, Dr. Hsiao, was how you see that we're sort of in the third generation of Taiwan studies. I wonder if you can sort of map out and sort of trace, you mentioned the evolutionary qualities of this field. If you can sort of map out what those generations were and what are the key features of these different generations of Taiwan studies to where we are now. Like, what are the key features? What are the sort of you mentioned in the book, you said there was you referenced used the term ideological shifts, I believe. What were the ideologies of these different generations of Taiwan studies?
I think there are three generations. When I say three generations, it's not only in terms of age, but the years, the decades. Well, I would say before 1980, say the 1960s and 70s, there were scholars, especially Western scholars, and also the scholars in Taiwan to study Taiwan. So that at that time, we call them the generation of studying Taiwan, but not Taiwan study. In other words, there is no particular or specific intention in mind to develop the field to make Taiwan as a field of such a field. So, for example, in the 1960s, anthropologists, there are many anthropologists come to Taiwan to study Taiwan villages, religion, and kingship, and even some were studying for example, on the faction election. But the reason they came to Taiwan to study Taiwan was because that they couldn't go to China. So in other words, that is the ideology. They actually wanted to study China. So they take Taiwan as another alternative, a substitute Chinese society. That was 1960 and 70. By 80s, they changed. I'm older, but Dafydd is much younger, but we promoted Taiwan study in the 1980s onwards. In other words, that Taiwan is not a substitute of something else. It's not a substitute, or it's not a replacement of some other societies, but rather Taiwan should be our main subject matter. So therefore, that's called Taiwan study, and has been grown for two decades now. Now after 2000, then when the Taiwan study has been steadily and established as a field of intellectual pursuit, then there are more and more a younger generation to come into. They say, "Oh, I'm going to do a study on Taiwan, and I think I am a scholar in Taiwan studies." And even some older scholars, they were kind of persuaded, as Daffyd mentioned, convinced that, okay, Taiwan study is fun. Taiwan study has a right, has its own right. So there was another one to come in too. So I think in a way, but then let me emphasize it, the development of Taiwan study actually is to me, is an intellectual movement. or we can call it intellectual institutionalization. And we can talk about that, how institutionalization took place since 1990s in Taiwan and spread around the world.
Let's do that right now. And I think that's a brilliant segue to my next question here. And but I do want to point out that the thread that you had mentioned with regards to sort of treating Taiwan in its own right and in its own light is is also very applicable in the Taiwan policy space. And I would just plug our GTI's annual symposium that we held last week, where we had the AIT director Brent Christensen in his closing keynote mentioned that for someone like him who's worked in the U.S. government and on Taiwan policy for decades, that he's really starting to see that people are starting to treat Taiwan in its own right, and for its intrinsic value, if you will. And so and again, I can see these parallels between sort of academia and policy. In some ways, sort of us in the policy space or the broader policy community is kind of catching up to academia in a way, which is quite interesting. But let's take let's broaden our scope a bit, and let's move on here to. So, how does the field of Taiwan studies then sort of compare, between the European, the American, and the sort of Japanese studies context of Taiwan studies? I think you guys are probably the most well equipped to answer this question, given all your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question allows me to kind of build on what Michael said earlier about the different generations. I think that to a certain extent, Taiwan studies emerges a little bit earlier in the US than it did in Europe. So, for example, in the 1990s, you already had a couple of US-based associations, the Political Science called Conference Group on Taiwan Studies, North American Taiwan Studies Association. There were a number of Taiwan Studies programs in the US in the 90s. There was the Emmy Sharp book series. So to a certain extent, we were kind of quite envious of the US. And a number of kind of junior scholars tried to take some of the US experience and bring it over to Europe. So, for example, when we created the European Association of Taiwan Studies, we had a model of what was going on in the US. We just tried to make it a little bit different. So we were a later developer in Europe. But I think that an advantage of being a later developer has been that I think that maybe the US Taiwan Studies field is a little bit more dispersed. Because you have a longer history. While, let's say, the European Association, I think, have been more successful at bringing basically everyone in Europe that does Taiwan together. While in the US, it often feels like there's kind of separate networks that don't always talk together or work together so well. And I think one of the things we've seen in the last 15 years is that a lot of really interesting developments have emerged in Europe. So, for example, the Routledge book series. I think we actually have a number of Taiwan-focused book series now in Europe. And I think even the International Journal of Taiwan Studies at the outset did have quite a European element, together with collaboration with Academia Sinica as well. So I think one of the things we actually found, speaking to US-based Taiwan studies scholars, was that there was more kind of optimism on the European side compared to the US side. I remember back 10 years ago, we had a US scholar coming to our conference talking about the decline or the death of Taiwan studies based on US experience. And we were quite kind of shocked there. But I think I've been quite encouraged about some of the more recent developments in the US. And I think that the kind of work that you're doing in GTI, I think, is also quite admirable. I think maybe in the Europe, we're not so strong in terms of the think tank scene on Taiwan. And maybe I should hand over to Michael, because you know more about both the Taiwan side and also the Japan side of Taiwan studies.
Okay, I want to echo what Russell just mentioned, that the birth of Taiwan study has a lot to do with the political democratization and indigenization and the development of new national identity. And that is really marked the difference, very different between Taiwan study as a field compared to other area studies. You see, if there is no political democratization, there would not be a field of Taiwan studies. So that is beginning in the 80s when the democratization took places. The venue where the birth of Taiwan study was in Academic Seneca, where I am now. In the early 1990s, the Academic Seneca began the quite a field work on Taiwan history, local history, on the 浊大计划, 浊水 River and river to study the Taiwan history. And so in 1994, Academic Seneca established the preparatory office of Taiwan history. Now, let me give you a background. In Academic Seneca, there were already by 1994, 2 other history institutes, History and Philology Institute, and also the Modern History. Why we needed another Taiwan History Institute? And because the scholars in the other 2 institutes did not take Taiwan history seriously enough. In other words, only take Taiwan history as a periphery or under the shadow of the Chinese history. So that's why, so it has a lot to do political reality. So that is one thing I wanted to emphasize. And because it happened in Taiwan, in Academic Seneca, so therefore the establishment of Taiwan history was the landmark, was the beginning of a Taiwan study. And in 1997 and onward, until now, there are 25 Taiwan study related department, graduate institute, center, or institutes. That's in Taiwan. And at the same time, in United States and UK and France, around the world, including Japan, by that beginning in the 1990s, SOAS, where Dafydd was the first overseas Taiwan Studies Center. It was established. There are 16 Taiwan study related center program and so on and so forth. And even the Ministry of Foreign Education in later on established Taiwan study programs or lecture series or chair, and there are 36 such programs, centers, institutes established, ranging from Asia, Southeast Asia, to Europe, to North America, and I think that, so that's called what I call institutionalization. And it's very important to see the spread out of Taiwan study from Taiwan to the rest of the world. And there are 2 interesting developments beyond the graduate program, the research programs. One is the International Journal of Taiwan Studies that was launched in 2018, 2 years ago. And now, and we also had the World Congress of Taiwan Study, and was began in 2012 in Academic Seneca. So in a way, I would like to say academic syndicates play a kind of an initiation role to promote the Taiwan study worldwide. And 2015 in SOAS, Dafydd was the co-organizer, and then returned to academic syndicate 2018. And now we are supposed to have a #4 World Congress in University of Washington at Seattle, but because of pandemic, so it was postponed to 2022 in Seattle. So we hope to want one conference in academic syndicate and one conference in one part of the world. And lastly, I want to emphasize this very new development, which make the complete picture of the world development of Taiwan study. The Encyclopedia of Taiwan Study. Brill is going to publish the Encyclopedia of Taiwan Study. I'm happy to be the editor-in-chief. I'm very happy Daffyd Fell will serve as an associate editor. I will have 11 actually associate editor range in 11 fields, ranging from sociology, political science, international relations, gender study, anthropology, archaeology, and so on, so forth. So actually, if you look at the later development, it's nothing different from every other area study. You need institution, you need a scholar get interested, you need publications, you need association, and you need hopefully we have an encyclopedia. And they are popular now to have an encyclopedia of this, encyclopedia of that. For example, Brill already published an encyclopedia of a Chinese religion. Now they are willing, they are delighted to publish the Encyclopedia of Taiwan Study. That means what? That means this represent the attention was given by many publisher academic world.
No, you've mentioned twice already, and so I do want to stick with this for a little bit and give you an opportunity to really kind of explain a bit more about this World Congress for Taiwan Studies. Now, you kind of explained this already in a way that I don't think there is any kind of similar institutions for UK studies or American studies or Japanese studies. I don't think there's a World Congress for those fields. So why was such an institution created in the first place, and what purpose does it serve? And if you could maybe go into a little bit in terms of what are the difficulties in getting something like this started and to keep it going.
Sorry, and Daffyd can edit. I think in other area study, there is the conventional way is to establish an international association of Japan study, international association of Latin American study, or Southeast Asian study, for example, which I know are very quite familiar. There are international association, there are international convention, international conferences. But the reason we call it World Congress, which I give the name, I think when we prepare, I think World Congress of Taiwan Study means we want to assemble as many as scholars who are working on Taiwan study together periodically to share their insight. Again, this is nothing new. The reason we want a World Congress instead of international association, because we don't want to bureaucratize it. So we want to, as a conference, a congress gathering format. So that is we try not to make international association, but when you have an international association or any association, you have to elect a president, you have to elect a secretary, treasurer. It's too much work. And also, one of the reasons I think when I say we want a World Congress instead of create another international association, exactly because we had 3 regional associations already. The Japan Association for Taiwan Studies, JETS. That was established in 1998. And then we have North American Taiwan Study, NASA, 1997. And we have EATS, European Association of Taiwan Study. And so we don't want to add another bureaucracy on top of it. So we hope that the World Congress can serve as assembling, integrating effort of scholars together. And that's why since the beginning of 2012, for the first World Congress, the three associations had to play an important role, sending their delegations and sending organized panels in the respective World Congresses. The difficulties is to find the local host. And Academic Seneca is committed to host when it comes back to Taiwan. I serve as in the Secretariat, and my job is trying to figure out who can be the next host after 3 years. Now we are very happy to have the University of Washington, Seattle to host the conference.
It's wonderful. Maybe a practical question here to focus a bit on maybe for the aspiring Taiwan scholars or more established Taiwan scholars, who may not have known about this World Congress. How do people get involved on that?
We have a secretariat, and we have secretariat establishing Academic Seneca. We have our website, and we really quite heavily depend on the three associations to spread through their websites, through their the word of mouth, and through their personal network, and invite them to take part, to join the conferences. And it went well. And of course, it involved the money, and we provide local. Usually, we provide the local expenses. For the local expenses, we'll take care of it. So through the social, that's why the three associations has played important roles. I want to add, we have a United States, Canada. It's a North American. We have a European. We have Japan. So we don't have the Southeast Asia. We don't have the Australia and New Zealand. And that will be our next goal, to encourage scholars, even though not many in Australia and New Zealand, a few. And we hope then they can study with a kind of a study group first. And Southeast Asia, because inspired by the New Southbound policy, I think they also has encouraged of more and more scholars in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Thailand, and to study Taiwan. So we hope in the near future, we will have a Southeast Asian Association of Taiwan Study and Australia, New Zealand Association of Taiwan Study. And Latin America, we don't know. Africa is a long shot.
This is really a fascinating discussion. And with the permission of our two panelists, I'd like to extend our discussion a little bit further than our scheduled 10 a.m. Closing time, because I noticed that there's questions from our audience are trickling in, but I still have several more questions that I'd like to ask the both of you before ceding the prerogative over to our audience members. So if that's okay, the both of you, then let's extend a little bit further from our at our close time. So I want to continue with the theme of sort of more practical sort of advice or suggestions you may have. In a way, the way I read this book, it sort of served as a manual of sort for research design as well as for conducting field work on Taiwan. This is relevant to the work that we do here at GTI because we have a scholarship program where we try to encourage researchers to conduct field work in Taiwan. So from the two of you, and also maybe what you can share from the authors of the book, what pro tips do you have for research design and field work, and what, in your view, are some of the hottest fields in Taiwan studies now?
Let me say a few things on that, because there were a couple of questions in there. I mean, for me, one of the most interesting elements of the book is where some of the practical sides. For example, a number of the chapters talk about that process of turning a PhD thesis into a book. What kind of things need to be changed to make it into a successful book manuscript? Because a perfect PhD is quite different from a strong academic volume. So one of the things we've seen in a number of the chapters is how authors adjusted their focus and adjusted their manuscript. So, for example, in the case of Tom Gold's book, State and Society and the Taiwan Miracle, his perhaps was the one that changed the most. Book was the historical chapter of his PhD. So he turned that chapter into a book. Others made adjustments to link in their project to academic disciplines. So, for example, Shelley Rieger's PhD was very focused on local politics, but her book combined local politics in Taiwan with democratic theory. So there were two kind of different strands there, and this was something. Often this comes out of negotiation with publishers. How to make the PhD project reach a wide audience. And one of the places we see this is in the titles of books, which were often adjusted to broaden the audiences. So, for example, another classic case is Melissa Brown's book, Is Taiwan Chinese? And in her case, the publishers wanted her to bring in China or Chinese into the title to broaden the audience, even though she admits herself that she doesn't fully answer that question. So that is, I think for me, that was really useful. So younger scholars can get a sense of how to negotiate with publishers, what kind of things to adjust. And just to kind of just say a few words on your second point about what are the hottest fields. Well, I think that's something that has changed over time, and we get a sense of that change through many of the chapters. So, for example, in the 1990s, a lot of the focus was on how do we explain Taiwan's democratic transition, and we see different approaches. For example, Michael's more kind of social movement kind of approach compared to Shelley Rieger's more kind of electoral democratization focus. And as we move into the post-2000 period, many of the publications on Taiwan have shifted to look at not so much why Taiwan democratizes, but to look at the quality and how we can kind of measure or assess the quality, or how we explain the way Taiwan's democracy functions. So we see a kind of a shift in a lot of the later chapters. Maybe I should hand over to Michael. Did you want to add anything on this topic?
Well, so you asked about how to get the young scholar attracted to Taiwan studies. It's very difficult. In Taiwan, most of the scholars in social sciences and humanities are working on Taiwan. Some will take competitive approaches to take Taiwan comparing with other society. So to get the Taiwan scholars in Taiwan is not a difficulty, but to get the young scholars interested in Taiwan study it takes a courage. You need the professor, scholars like a Daffyd Fell to encourage his student and make sure he got a proper supervision. So again, even though we are very eager to develop Taiwan study as a legitimate field, and as a growing field, but we still respect the intellectual freedom that this is a matter of choice. But practical side, Taiwan, the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs also provide scholars. They call Taiwan Fellowship. I think every year we have more than 100 scholars, junior, PhD student, or postdoc, or junior professors or senior professors can apply, come to Taiwan to study. So that was the opportunity. But again, I think the key is to get in overseas. You need a professor, you need a supervisor who already in the Taiwan study field. That's important. The other thing, what is a hard area? I think I agree with Daffyd mentioned about the democratization. That is in the social sciences. In the humanities, I think in the very beginning, literature, cinema, and always being a very hot and popular issues. Because if you look at literature, I think it's really, that's because Taiwan also in the mid-1970s experienced called indigenous literature movement. During the time, in the early 60 and 70, the Taiwan literature were very called a modern literature. That means out of a context. Even the poetry is out of a context. But now the writers largely called indigenous or nativist literature movement, 乡土文学. So they create a lot of very rich novels, literature work. And later 80s, and then even we have a called new cinema, 新电影. That was an outgrowth of the indigenous literatures. So I think in humanities, I think literature, cinema, documentary, the very films and popular culture are the new rising field. And the other field, the other area, hot area is the national identity, which is very, very important. That is a shared cross-border, is shared by Japanese scholars, North American scholars, European scholars, and Taiwanese scholars, all work on the making of the new national identity. And that relates to democratization. And the other issue is probably an indigenous people, the Austronesian. And it caught a lot of attention from Taiwan scholars around the world. And lastly, is not the least, I think cross-strait relations, also a very popular topic, especially IR people, political science, and among others. So I think it's a real range. That's why I thought it's a very rich. And that's, I want to add here, since the development of Taiwan studies, the existing theories, concept, analytical tool has helped the enrichment, the development of Taiwan study. So, and the phase one is what social sciences and humanities contributed to the field of Taiwan studies. And from now on, I think we will envision that Taiwan study can contribute to the completeness of modern social sciences and humanities. So and up to now, we have to rely on many, many useful theories, theorizing tool existing in social science and humanity to explain the multifaceted aspects of Taiwan development. But we hope that Taiwan experience can be used for the future to make the current social sciences and humanity more globalized rather than American or European centered.
Yeah, definitely.
What Michael said, I think the Taiwan studies field is really, really diverse. And I think for those of us that are involved in the field, I think this is one of the attractions. It means that we can kind of get out of our regular disciplinary boundaries, so I can get out of politics and get to know about Taiwan cinema, Taiwan literature, and that's one of the wonderful things about going to a Taiwan Studies conference. And I think it, as a political scientist, I feel it does actually enrich my own work. So I can bring in Taiwan film into my teaching, often because a lot of Taiwanese film or documentary is reflecting what's going on in Taiwan politics or Taiwan society. But I think there's so many, one of our challenges in doing Taiwan studies is how do we make Taiwan interesting to people who don't actually have a link to Taiwan? And I think there's so many stories. For example, students at my university love to protest. So they get very excited when they hear about Taiwanese social movements. And I think similarly, I think Michael mentioned Indigenous studies. I think, again, that's another way that we've kind of brought in people to think about Taiwan. Or gender studies is another area. In many of our events, I think the campaign, for example, for same-sex marriage has made Taiwan visible and understandable and interesting to a lot of people that in the past didn't really have that linkage there. So that's one of our challenges. How do we bring in new audiences to the Taiwan studies field? And Taiwan has so many amazing stories to actually inspire potential readers and audiences.
Dr. Fell, I mean, that's a great segue. I mean, you both of you just, I think, brought up so many rich points here that we could really just draw on for hours if we had the time. But I do want to focus on one thing that you had mentioned earlier, which was on the issue. This again sort of focuses on somewhat of the on the practical aspects of this field, but also some of the practical challenges of trying to start a career in this field. And that is this thread that pervades some of the experiences of many of the authors is the pressure that they felt from their publishers to ensure the to reach the marketability, if you will. I think that's the terminology we use here of their books on Taiwan. And so maybe if you can just sort of take a step back here and say and help us understand a little bit about what are some of the sort of deeply ingrained biases in academia on Taiwan studies. And are they still present today? I mean, you've highlighted how they were in the past in terms of how it was sort of considered a long considered a subset of a broader sort of sinology field, and I would just add that is that is also the case in our policy world. But on academia, are those sort of biases still present today as you are now sort of still currently and currently developing this field? And are they more or less? And I'll tack on one question with this one. We often frequently hear now about publishers censoring content that are critical of China. Are there any censoring of content and subject matter related to Taiwan and Taiwan studies? Can you maybe shed some light on those questions, please?
I think the Taiwan study, like any other area studies, has been discriminated and looked down upon by the mainstream social sciences, humanities, especially biased by the disciplinary. So in a way, so I think we actually for this generation, for the second generation and the third generation, luckily, we are very much based on disciplinary. We are taking a very different disciplinary approach to different field of Taiwan. So therefore, it's very important. It's a key to be a good sociologist on Taiwan. You cannot claim I'm a Taiwan expert, but you have to be from which discipline you are speaking of, and you have to make your research theoretically sound, and that can make a contribution to the field of discipline. For example, sociology, political science, or in sociology in the field of the democratization in middle class study, in the income inequality or gender issue. So I think the key is to be a good disciplinary scholar. And then you have a secondary field called Taiwan study. I think this is important. I think as I see now, I think this is the common trend. I think it's a healthy trend. And the other thing is you mentioned about how I think it's very important for the younger scholar to come up and to really to appreciate the field of Taiwan study in such a way that they can have an ambition to say, I'm going to work on the holistic view of Taiwan, and also can contribute back feedback to the disciplinary field. Daffyd, you have something?
Yeah, I want to add a few things. I mean, I would totally agree about the importance of disciplinary training. I think it's critically important for us to be able to talk to audiences, make Taiwan interesting to disciplinary audiences. So we have to really know those kind of concepts, those kind of theories, that kind of language. And that's one of the key things that we need to train our students to do. And that allows us to publish in disciplinary journals. Overall, though, my sense is it's become easier to publish on Taiwan than in the past. In other words, I think the publishing field is more, it's definitely much more favorable. So, for example, I know in the book, Shelley Rigger mentions that today she could probably publish a book on local factional politics in Taiwan. But 25 years ago, publishers wouldn't touch that. So they would see that as too niche. But now it is possible as a result of book series developments and also journal developments. I think so long as you can really kind of engage with theoretical concepts, I think it's definitely easier to publish on Taiwan. I think another area that was improved is also funding. I think Michael's touched upon this. So I think PhD funding, fieldwork funding is also much more available than even when I was doing my PhD 25 years ago. So I think these are also areas where the field is actually more favorable than in the past.
You know, I didn't expect that I will be able to get through my questions, and so, but I haven't. And but I do want to give our audience members a chance to engage in our discussion today. And so, what I'd like to close with my line of questioning is with a question that, you know, for much of our discussion, we've focused on the current and on the past. And I wonder if you can take a look into the future, if you will, gaze into your crystal ball. But in fact, you probably don't have to gaze because you guys are actually involved in the field of developing this area of studies. Where do you see and hope to see the field of Taiwan studies going maybe 10 years from now? Yep.
Okay. I think 10 years from now, we hope more people, more scholar, more well-trained scholar, young and old, can involve in the field of Taiwan study. And then Taiwan study can move into the second phase. That means Taiwan study can contribute to the social sciences and humanities. For example, I myself, for the last 30-some years, I did find to take the Taiwan experience of Taiwan's environmental movement, to take Taiwan's civil society activism, to take Taiwan's the middle classes study, can really challenge the existing Western-dominated theories on environmentalism, on middle classes, on civil society, even on democracy. So I think that I'm sure many other scholars, look back what they have done and really can make it, can dig into what this Taiwan study in X field, Y field, or Z field can contribute to back. So that's what I say. Now we are theorizing Taiwan, and we hope in the future we can have a Taiwan theories. David?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing that I would add here is about sustainability, and how do we kind of make this field sustainable? A number of the programs that we've touched upon in Europe and North America are quite reliant on Taiwan government funding. So I think that one of the things that we need to do is to try and make our projects a little bit more kind of institutionalized, because I think that quite a lot of Taiwan study programs have emerged and then disappeared because they weren't fully institutionalized. So, and I think that's particularly an issue for a more kind of market-dominated university sector like the UK, where basically if we don't have enough students, modules will close. So I think working out how to be more sustainable is an important challenge. And I know that as the European Association are working in that direction. But I think it's definitely something that we need to kind of work on.
Lots of questions about publications. Actually, in the last 10 years, we have witnessed more and more books published in English on Taiwan, which is very unusual, very unusual. Because now I just in my desk, there's one the charismatic movement in Taiwan from 1945 to 1995. It's about talk about the Protestant Christianity, and the abandon of books. So actually now it's more easier to get attention, get the interest of publishers to publish books on Taiwan than before.
Yeah, I mean, it was so, when I was an undergraduate student, it was trying to find English language material on Taiwan. It was so much harder. The literature was so, but now it's the opposite situation. The literature is so diverse, so we're often quite spoiled for choice. So I think it's it's something that we should feel proud of, and I think it's one of the things that makes Taiwan much easier to study now. It means that we can run courses on Taiwan where it's not essential to read Chinese, and that wasn't the case, let's say, 3 decades ago.
Still, we face another problem is that where we have much richer literatures on Taiwan study in Chinese, and they have not been read by the Western scholars. So that is how we can really promote the Chinese language literatures on Taiwan study into the non-Chinese world. That's the challenge we are facing now, right?
Fascinating discussion, and I know that we can really just really go on and on and on about all the important points that you've raised in the past hour. But I promised that we will get to the audience and take some of their questions. And just as a reminder to audience members who have not submitted their questions yet and want to, you may do so by sending an email to contact@globaltaiwan.org or use the chat function on our YouTube page or tweet us at Global Taiwan. Again, this is a discussion with the co-editors of this volume, Taiwan Studies Revisited, with Dr. Daffyd Fell and Dr. Hsin-Huang Michael Hsiao. So let's get to our questions here. The first question is from the Voice of America, reported there with her name is Tina Chung. Her question is, With growing interest in Taiwan studies, we're also hearing now a call for Taiwanese themselves to, quote, tell a good Taiwan story, end quote. What do you think would be a good Taiwan story? What are the strengths of Taiwan when they've been isolated and marginalized internationally for so long? Maybe they don't even know what they should be highlighted or presented to the world. Question. So, gentlemen.
There actually is not only one Taiwan story. There are many, many Taiwan stories. Started with democratization, national identity, and to deal with the pressure from the other side of a strait, PRC. And there are many stories can be there. How can Taiwan survive? It's not only survive, but thrive. So I think there are many, many stories can be told. And then need a serious study rather than just crying for assistance, support from the rest of the world, but rather to show how Taiwanese people consolidate themselves and to face the difficulties. So if you look at the COVID-19, actually the Taiwan experience, really interesting. And I think according to my observation, according to our Vice President Chen Jianren, and we can summarize it into one, government effectiveness. Second, transparency. You need, look at it during the period of time from February to May, every day, 3 p.m., everybody in Taiwan will turn on TV to watch what happened if we have another case or not. And that is transparency. And the transparency only can be made through democracy. So that is the second experience. The third ingredient, I think, is very important. As a sociologist, I would say public trust. Trust of the people in the government. That's very unusual. And in democratic society, the trust in institution has been eroding. But because of COVID-19, the public trust in government regained in an unbelievable high level. So I think the trust people each other, and trust people can protect themselves, wear mask, for example. So I think you can tell the many stories can be told, but they need a systematic sorting out. Dafydd?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's so many kind of remarkable that I think make Taiwan interesting and potentially even a model. I think the COVID one, from a European angle, I think it's we're kind of very almost jealous of Taiwan in terms of continuing life as normal. And I think that this is right. I think Michael is right that a lot of it is down to effective governance. I think but I think a lot really depends on the audience we're talking to. For example, in the past, I've told the story of Taiwan's anti-nuclear movement to an anti-nuclear UK audience, and in the past they weren't aware of the Taiwan case, but I think they were quite astounded about and the way that, let's say, social movements were able to build up political support for their cause. So I think a lot really depends on the audience. But I think that in response to Tina's question, there are just so many stories that Taiwan can tell, and I think the COVID one is at the moment is a great story. Why couldn't the European countries learn from the Taiwan case? We often hear we still hear more in the media about South Korea success, but in reality, I think those of us that know Taiwan know that Taiwan has been much more successful than the Korean case.
Our next question is from Dr. Chen Jie, Discipline Chair at Political Science, International Relations. I believe Dr. Chen is in Australia. So this is nice to see you again, even though online. I have an excellent PhD student from Indonesia who studies Taiwan's new southbound policy. Do you have anything to say to encourage Southeast Asian students and scholars to research Taiwan without being overshadowed by the Greater China framework? End question.
Let me answer that. I think that's what I say. We hope that we can have the development of a Taiwan studies field in Southeast Asia as a result of the new southbound policy. I think I will encourage your Indonesian student come to Taiwan and to not necessarily study new southbound policy, but to study why Taiwan launched new southbound policy. I think one of the reasons is to shift. It's not just for trade or investment. It's to launch a new regional strategy of Taiwan. Shift from the Northeast Asian identity to the Southeast Asian identity. I think, and then also because diplomatic isolation, Taiwan need new southbound policy to develop the outreach, take it people-centered. So I think I will encourage a student in Southeast Asia and South Asia and to Taiwan to look at a very the areas beyond economy and trade and investment. And I think that's important. And then my foundation, the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation, we are doing exactly that, trying to make a think tank cooperation and also the scholar exchange.
Great. The next question is from Jens Gam from the European Institute for Chinese Studies, Paris, and a board member at the European Association for Taiwan Studies. And his question is, how do you evaluate the importance of Taiwan studies on, quote, Sinophone studies, end quote? How do you overcome the dichotomy between China and Taiwan?
I think that's good on this one. I mean, I personally don't really see any contradiction here between being a Taiwan studies scholar and being someone in the China studies field. I think a lot of us in for example, the UK who work on Taiwan do operate in China studies departments, and we have to often have to teach China while maybe our research focuses on Taiwan. And I think that to a certain extent, Taiwan studies in the UK has actually benefited from a growth of the kind of China studies field. So I don't really see a problem here. I tend to hear that clash more in the US than at least in the UK. I don't know whether I think I'd say that for many of us that are doing Taiwan, we tend to have kind of multiple identities, maybe disciplinary, but as well as being in China studies, but also in Taiwan studies. So for us, kind of negotiating those kind of boundaries. And I know that the way this issue is viewed is a little bit different in Taiwan itself. And I think Michael would probably want to comment on that.
I do not see the clash. Well, if there is a clash, I think that's because you take an exclusive way. But my approach is that we can be parallel. We can develop a Taiwan study, and also another group of people working on China study. It's okay too, as long as we say each field has its own merit. That's important. The other thing is to work together. We can actually do the comparative study. I always encourage. I myself is a comparative sociologist. I work on the civil society in Asia. I work on democracy in Asia, and also look at environmental movement in Asia. So I think that sometimes we include China too. So I think by including Taiwan into the Chinese study or include China into the Taiwan study can be beneficial, because you can see two different ethnic Chinese societies development under very different political systems. And if you want to have it ambitious enough, you can include Hong Kong, you can include Singapore, you can include overseas, the Chinese diaspora into this Taiwan study as an outreach competitive study. So I think it's good. I think when the scholars in China study should welcome the Taiwan study. Taiwan study should welcome the Chinese study, and to work together to launch a competitive and theory-driven study, research.
That's a very interesting point. The two fields should not be seen as mutually exclusive. Our next question is directed to Dr. Hsiao. This is from Christine Murata, who's the director of the research unit of Taiwanese culture and literature at Ruhr University in Germany. Her question is, I would like to ask about the feasibility you see to position Taiwan studies within the area studies of the neighboring countries, except China. So, for instance, the Philippines, Vietnam, Okinawa, also Japan and Korea. How do you see the options and the interest of the academic circles in these respective countries for dialogue and cooperation with I guess, Taiwanese counterparts?
I certainly welcome if such a program is to be launched. I certainly will welcome that one. And then actually there are many other. That's what I say is competitive. You can have a launch the competitive studies to put Taiwan study within the context of an Asian, Pan-Asia development. I think we can do that. If you want to make a more specific Taiwan case study, can be very good to compare with Okinawa and with Hokkaido, and you can compare with the Indonesian island state. So island country can be another theoretical anchor to look at. And especially nowadays, we look at the sustainable development, environmental climate change. I think that can be. So actually, the Taiwan study, the good development of Taiwan study can benefit many emerging fields to fill the Taiwan study in to make it a complete, make it compatible. So I think Taiwan, Philippines, I think she mentioned about Okinawa or something, right? Yeah, I think that to me right away is an island study, right? Island society. And the island culture, island society, island politics are very different from continental studies. So I think that is interesting. So in such a way, we can develop a island sociology, island economics, island political science, yeah, or island history.
I'd love to pull that thread a bit, if I may, especially on Okinawa, and I want to get your observations about, just the extent of academic cooperation between Taiwan and Okinawa. What is the sort of the history there, and what are some of the the relationships that you highlight, this sort of the sense of island culture that the two share, but can you sort of expand a bit on the Taiwan Okinawa connections there?
In academic syndic in my institute, I established called the Comparative Asian Societies, or no, Comparative Asian Social Transformation Research Group, and we have a small sub theme called Okinawan Studies. And so I think that if you look at the Okinawan history, really make it they also experience called the Okinawan identity. It's really different from Japanese, So actually, if you look at it carefully, you can see that. But I think so far as it's just in the very beginning.
Daffyd?
I think that one of the strategies that I've often used to kind of bring people into Taiwan is to teach Taiwan comparatively, particularly comparisons with South Korea and Japan. We teach a number of modules that look at the comparative politics or comparative political economy of these three democracies. And often that way we bring in people who originally were much more Korea or Japan focused, and then just force them to do this kind of comparison. And I found that very, very useful. I think that one of the chapters in the book that does this is Joseph Wong's book, Healthy Democracies, which looks at welfare state development in South Korea and Taiwan. And I think that really shows the way that I think Taiwan comparison with South Korea is a really good, works well on a number of topics like welfare state, democratization, civil society, middle class.
We are approaching the end of our extended time, and I don't want to impose on any more of both of your time for the rest of the day. I know it's getting quite late right now in Taiwan, especially, and so. But I do want to close with the final question here from Jennifer Chang, who is a research fellow here at the Global Taiwan Institute, and her question is: to what extent do systemic and structural issues, for example, Taiwan's external environment or major power competition, shape the issues in Taiwan studies? What are some unique methodologies used in Taiwan studies research? For instance, using Taiwanese language as opposed to Mandarin Chinese? Question mark. So if we can close with those questions, gentlemen, take it, whoever want to jump in, go ahead.
I'll give that one to Michael.
I think Daffyd, you, right?
I mean, the impact of external factors is an interesting one, and it kind of makes me think of Dennis Hickey's argument about Taiwan being a shrimp between whales. And I think that one of the things that came out of some of the statistical studies on Taiwan studies was the way that cross-strait tension seems to increase the academic interest in Taiwan. So, for example, the 1995-96 crisis did seem to lead to a kind of a rise in academic studies. But I think that only applies in certain academic fields. So I think to a certain extent, in many of the kind of the topics that we've talked about, we don't actually need to focus on external factors, such as the if we're looking at issues such as same-sex marriage, for example. I think one of the things that made that topic really interesting was the fact that we could discuss that topic without a focus on cross-strait relations. So it was quite different from most of the news stories that we see in the international media on Taiwan. That's my kind of brief thought. Michael?
I can think of one which is very unique, is from a Taiwanese perspective to self-reflection of how Taiwanese in general, in different generations, by different ethnic groups and by region, how they perceive themselves as a Chinese versus Taiwanese. I think Taiwan experienced a Chinese identity to a Taiwanese identity. I think this shift is very important, and is because of first, I think the early phase was because of KMT as an immigrant state coming to Taiwan to authoritarian regime, so the Taiwanese identity emerged against the nationalist control. But now, no longer KMT factor. Now it's a China factor. So this growing Taiwanese identity It's not so much against KMT per se, because KMT has been Taiwanized. Now is another external state, PRC, trying to take over Taiwan. So that is the others for to developing Taiwan identity is PRC, is no longer internal, so external. So I think that is very important. It takes decades. It takes 3 decades to see that. I think that is something on the Taiwan study. That's why national identity is such a booming and interesting and multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary field of research.
And that is not only in Taiwan, but also, broadly also throughout the region as well, right? And arguably throughout the world. And so I think, studying Taiwan as a case study, of this broader sort of phenomenon, I think goes to the heart of your point about how do you sort of make Taiwan's experience more broadly applicable to global trends and phenomena that we see. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fascinating and enriching discussion. We went well beyond our originally planned schedule. It's already 10:30 here in Washington D.C. But I think it was well worth it. Again, for all the aspiring Taiwan scholars out there, and as well as established Taiwan scholars who may not be familiar with this work and the great work that the two of our panelists here are doing to really establish Taiwan studies institutions worldwide. This is the Taiwan Studies Revisited by Dr. Daffyd Fell, co-edited by Dr. Daffyd Fell and Michael Hsiao. If you're not already subscribed to receive all our updates, please do so on our website, again, at www.globaltaiwan.org. Thank you both, gentlemen, very much. Take care and have a great rest of your day and have a great evening. Take care.
Yep, you too.
Okay.
See you. Bye.